Most of my life, I did not have a relationship with God or even know that God was real. I began searching at a young age for some way to fulfill the need and the desire in me to feel complete. And I started with lying to my parents when I was a kid. I was the kid who always got in trouble in high school. I'd cut class, I'd be in school suspension, going to parties, never really having a solid group of friends. I just didn't feel like I belonged, and I was always seeking some way to fit in or get the approval of other people. After barely graduating high school in New Jersey, I decided to go into the Air Force to become a man and really make my parents proud of me. But while I was in there, I really began to question my existence, and I began to ask myself, well, what really happens after we die, and is God real? After a few bad experiences with some churches that I had been invited to, I decided to go in a different direction. Churches and Christians to me were just a bunch of hypocrites who really didn't practice what they preached, and I didn't want anything to do with that. Shortly after I got out of the Air Force, so I kind of turned my back on the idea of Christianity, and I decided to go into the world of drugs in order to try and expand my mind. Meth, ecstasy, going to raves, trying to find out who I was and experience some kind of spiritual enlightenment through the chemicals that I was putting into my body. I was always the person to do way too much, and somebody would find me comatose and have to call an ambulance. I decided to get away from the meth, and I was still questioning my purpose and my existence. So one night I decided to take a bottle of 50 Benadryl, and I don't remember much, but I wound up coming back to consciousness in the hospital, and they put me in a psych ward and diagnosed me with bipolar manic depressive disorder and started me on some psychiatric medication. And after I got that diagnosis, I really identified with it, and I thought to myself, this is the reason I am the way I am, because I have this disorder. That must be why I have so many problems. So I kind of latched onto that. I took it as my own, and it gave me a reason to really be messed up. So since the prescriptions I had weren't really enough to make me feel good, I decided to do more drugs in combination with those psychiatric meds, and that was like playing with fire. I would mix the chemicals, I'd wind up overdosing, and somebody would find me. A family member, my dad, my mom, my sister. So it went from overdosing to actually being so depressed and feeling like such a failure that I had the desire to take my own life. I decided to make that attempt purposefully. I took 2 bottles of cough syrup, about 80 Tylenol PM, whatever I could find, and I tried to kill myself because I just had enough. I felt like I failed at life, failed at high school, failed at everything else, and I was a disappointment, and it would be much better that I just didn't exist. I woke up in a hospital like 24 hours later and realized that I wasn't dead, and I was angry. I was so angry that my life was not over. I didn't see any white light, I didn't see any angels or have a near-death experience, and that's what I wanted, so it was really frustrating for me. So I went back into a treatment program. Nothing really seemed to help. I would stay clean for 3 months, 6 months at a time, but I would always compromise somewhere. And I just couldn't conquer my addictive nature. My life was really always waiting for the next bad thing to happen. A month later, after that first suicide attempt, I decided to try a different way, and I actually cut my own wrists open and then overdosed at the same time to make sure that I was dead this time. I did it in my bedroom upstairs. But I didn't know that my sister was home from college, and she just happened to come to the house while I was bleeding under the covers, and she found me and called the ambulance. So after that, my life really got progressively worse. Nobody really trusted me. They just figured I would end up dead if I kept going in the way I was going. I had let my parents down, employers down, I'd let myself down. And during this same time, my parents, after 25 years, were going through a divorce. My father moved into his auto repair shop, and after that divorce, we really spent a lot of time together. On December 7th, 2004, I got a call from a family member that no one had heard from my dad over the weekend. So that morning, I drove out to his shop and went inside. I called out to my dad. He didn't answer. I went up to where his little apartment was, and I found him hanging from the ceiling. So my world began to spin upside down even more than it already was. I was angry. I was frustrated. Any hint of an idea that there was a God in my life was completely erased, because how could a God who loved me, if there was one, allow me, after already messing up my life, to find my own father now dead? So I really took all that anger and projected it into more of a reason to hurt myself and destroy my life. I learned how to shoot up heroin, and the heroin just numbed me to where I didn't have to deal with anything. I didn't have to deal with the death of my father. I didn't have to deal with all my past failures and who I was or who I thought I was. So I continued. After about a year, my body began to shut down. I developed an infection in my lungs. You'd think I'd learned my lesson after what the drugs were doing to my body, but I would get right back up and start using immediately. That was just my life. Heroin was my life. After a while, my mother called me from Florida, and she said, "Nicholas, why don't you go back to school?" So I finished a semester at that college, but I was drinking, and the cycle of addiction wasn't broken. Nothing in me was healed or fixed. It was just another replacement for me and another way to find approval. And I wound up on the streets of Florida. It was the last straw, really, for any of my family. No one trusted me, not even my mother. In December of 2006, my mother told me that I couldn't come back to live with her, but there was a program in Midland, Texas called Teen Challenge. She explained to me that it was a program for adults and it was a faith-based program. And I thought to myself, a Christian program, faith-based. Well, I really don't want anything to do with that, but I have nothing else. I lost everything. And I left Florida in January of 2007, completely hopeless, suicidal, out of my mind. Stopped all the drugs that I was doing, stopped all the pills. And I remember being on the flight thinking, I don't think I can do this. And I was sitting pretty close to the emergency exit. And I kept eyeing it as I was flying to Texas, thinking to myself, I should just jump out of this plane. Just bust open the emergency door and jump out. And I was about to do it. Some voice or something in me stopped me from doing it. Looking back now, it was just the voice of God conquering the voice of the enemy that was so prevalent in my mind for so many years. I would just do whatever he told me to do. Use this, do this. If it feels good, do it. So I held on for that plane ride, and I landed in Midland, Texas. I talked to the intake coordinator who helped me get in the program, and she had a similar story. She was in and out of hospitals and did the same drugs I did and was completely hopeless also. And she sounded happy. Her life seemed fulfilled. She had a joy that I wanted, a happiness and a peace that I just began to be jealous for. And it was real. It wasn't like fake Christian or the hypocrite label that I'd labeled so many Christians with. So I decided to give Jesus a try. And I began to read his word for the first time really in my life and start to understand it. And I began to get on my knees and pray, which was something that was foreign to me, talking to this God that I was so angry at before. And after a few weeks, I decided I'm going to give my life to Jesus Christ. And I just prayed that he would speak to me and that I would experience him in a real way, and I did. I had times where I would be weeping at the altar at the church services we went to, and it wasn't manipulated, it wasn't anything else except real to me. And I began to just feel hope rise up through all the darkness that was in my mind. And it wasn't instant, it was progressive, but slowly the depression stopped, the suicidal thoughts stopped, and I began to feel like I had hope. And God just began to pour out his Spirit into my life. And I began to develop a love for him like I've never had before. He said, "Nicholas, I have a plan for you. You just have to wait on me." And I decided to wait because everything else in my life, if it wasn't working out, I would just leave. Psalm 40 says, "I waited patiently for the Lord, and he turned to me and he heard my cry. He pulled me up out of the mud and the mire, and he set my feet on a solid place." And that's what he did. As I waited for him, he pulled me out of that mud and that dirt that I was in for so long, the pit of addiction and suicide and depression. And that verse goes on to say, he put a new song in my mouth, a song of praises and hymns to God. And that's what he did with me. My song before was always darkness and death and failure and depression. And he put a song of hope, a song of peace, a song of love. And I just had to sing that song. I had to tell other people about Jesus, and I knew that that's what I was going to do with the rest of my life. I began to go on rallies with the groups from Teen Challenge, and people would come up to me after and say, "Your testimony, your story really touched me, and it changed my life." And I'm sitting here thinking, my story is changing your life? That has to be something supernatural that's not of me. And this is what I'm called to do. Tell other people about where God can take you from, and that he's a restoring God and a God of hope and a God of love. Shortly after graduating, I was asked to come on at my home church as a full-time youth pastor. I knew that I didn't want to be alone, and I prayed that God would send me a wife. And I knew that he would answer prayer because he answered the prayer of rescuing me out of darkness. And he did the same thing by sending me my wife, who was also a Teen Challenge graduate from the same program that I was in. So we met and entered into full-time ministry together, and haven't turned back ever since. I never went back to drugs, never went back to the darkness, and God's proven faithful in our lives. And now I have the honor and the privilege of pastoring a church, and every week telling people about the truth of the Word and who Jesus is and how he can still change lives and still does change lives. And I'm walking proof of that, and my wife is walking proof of that.
This boyfriend got mad at me and told me, "You'll never handle the drug world." And I said, "Oh yeah, watch me." And I took a nosedive off into a drug world that I had no idea what was going to happen. When I was a junior, my mom was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis, and the rheumatoid arthritis had attacked her internal organs, which created a number of other problems, and she continued to be rushed to the ER I was in a car accident at the end of my junior year and totaled my car. And because of that car accident, I was injured and taken off the softball team and unable to play for the rest of the season and possibly the next year. I made some new friends who weren't playing softball, and they taught me that taking pain medication would numb any pain or anxiety or any emotions that I had. So having them over to my house, they realized that my mom had pain medication, and I would go in and take a few of her pills here and there and just hope that she wouldn't notice. At like 16, I would use a fake ID to get into the bars. And I wouldn't just drink to party or have a good time. I was drinking to get drunk and black out. I remember very clearly being in a bank parking lot, and I'd just taken out some money, probably to buy alcohol or drugs. And my dad called me and said that my mom had been rushed to the ER. I went and visited her for a little while and then left. I went to get ready to go out, and I was going to stop by the hospital that night on my way to the bar with my friends. And so I went home and got all dressed and ready to go out, stopped by the hospital for just a few minutes. I held her hand and kissed her on the forehead, and I told her, "Mom, I love you, and I'll be back tomorrow." That night, I went out and I partied hard, and went home and passed out. The next morning, I woke up to my dad knocking on my bedroom door, and when I opened it, he bear hugged me and told me that he had lost his best friend, that she had died, that her heart gave out. I remember having conversations with my dad and him thanking me for not being like some of those other kids that run off and do drugs and drink and run away and do crazy things when one of their parents dies. And little did he know that I had been using for months before this. I promised him that I would do good in school, and so I graduated high school and graduated in the top of my class and did really well. For graduation, I wanted to have a party at my house, and I had some people that purchased alcohol and brought it to my house in hopes that we would just all stay there and party and not get out and drive. I had a boyfriend who was going to sweep me off my feet. He was amazing, and I just thought that everything was going great. And I went to look for him and found him in my bedroom closet smoking meth with another guy. He handed me a pipe and taught me how to smoke meth. My drug use continued for a few months after that, and this boyfriend got mad at me for one reason or another and told me, "You'll never handle the drug world." And I said, "Oh yeah, watch me," being a stubborn kid right out of high school. And I took a nosedive off into a drug world that I had no idea what was going to happen. I ended up bouncing from drug house to drug house, from drug dealer to drug dealer, sleeping anywhere that I possibly could and with whoever I wanted to. I gave my body to drugs, and I gave my body to people. I ended up getting mixed up with the Mexican mafia and ended up in a hotel room. The police ended up showing up and arresting me, and that was the first time I went to jail. I called my dad with my phone call, and he called a bail bondsman friend, and they bonded me out. And I got out, and I went right back to doing the exact same thing, bouncing from house to house, stealing what I could to get what I needed. I got mixed up in some organized crime rings, running drugs in between, running guns in between. People would steal cars and credit cards and debit cards and IDs. So I started writing checks. That's how I got my drugs, and that's how I got my money. I ran off to a neighboring town and met this man who was going to be like a father figure to me. He was going to help me pay off my probation fees. He was going to take care of me and pay for things for me. So he took me from this house and took me out to a house in the country and introduced me to a man who taught me how to manufacture meth. I would never mix my own drugs or stick a needle in my own arm. I always found somebody else to do it. There were several times that I woke up and either he was touching me, my pants would be around my ankles, or I didn't know how I had gone to sleep. After months and months of this, I decided I'd had enough and I wanted to get away. And so we would go into town and we would get ingredients and we would come back out and we would cook the meth and then we would go back in and we would sell the drugs, and it was just a repetitive cycle. And so I told him, I'm going to get this stuff, but you can't go in with me because they don't know you. Well, he caught on very quickly and asked me if I was trying to leave, and I told him no. And he jumped over on top of me in the truck and proceeded to beat me up. And he hit me over and over and then grabbed a knife off the dash of the truck and tried to cut at me. I held him off with all my strength. Tried to roll down the window to scream for help, but there was nobody around who would have heard me. He eventually gave up and jumped over in the driver's seat of the truck. And while I tried to recompose myself and catch my breath from him trying to strangle me, he drove off to this deserted area where there were some dead trees and rocks. And he pulls up and gets out of the truck and tells me to get out. When I get out, he throws a shovel at me and he tells me to start digging. He wanted me to dig my own grave. He was going to kill me. His dog barked at him, grabbed his attention, and so in sandals I take off running. I couldn't run very fast, and he caught me. He walked back and picked the shovel up, and there was nothing but darkness. There was nothing that told me that there was a God. If there was a God, why would he take my mom away? I had been through so many awful things. How could there possibly be a God? But Jeremiah 33:3 says, "Call to me and I will answer you and show you great and mighty things which you do not know." And as he came back at me with that shovel, I cried out to whatever, and I said, somebody has got to help me. And it was like he ran into an invisible wall. His countenance changed, his demeanor changed, his eyes changed, everything about him changed, and he turned around, walked back to the truck, threw the shovel in and said, "Get in before I change my mind," and I did. I was terrified and I had no idea what had just happened. We went back to the house and I took some pain medication and went to sleep, and when I woke up, he was asleep, and so I plotted with another girl that was living there to get away, and so we rigged up an old car and we took off down the highway as fast as we could. For about 2 weeks, he messaged me all day, every day. "I miss you. Please come back. I love you so much." At the end of those 2 weeks, he sent me a message that said, "Please come back. I know where your dad lives." And I was so afraid for what he could possibly do to my dad that I went back. I was still using and using more and more all the time until I woke up one morning and he was on top of me, trying to rape me. I got away and he didn't chase after me. And so I came out of the room and he was gone, and the police were pulling up in a driveway and they were there to pick me up on a warrant that wasn't mine, and they took me to jail that day. I went to jail for that one warrant and ended up with 26 charges. And I got in trouble for giving tattoos. They put me in solitary confinement for 30 days. And there was a woman on the other side of the wall that would put coffee in a piece of notebook paper. She would write the promises of God. God loves you no matter what. God is faithful. God never changes. He doesn't care what you've done. He just cares about you and he loves you. So because of her words, I talked to the chaplain and I started a Bible study. And after I got done reading the Book of Hope, I got down on my knees and I threw my hands up in the air and I said, "God, if you get me out of this, I'll serve you for the rest of my life." 2 days later, I got out of solitary confinement, called my dad, and he answered the phone. And he said, "I found you a bed in Teen Challenge." So about a week later, I went to court for the first time, and they had lost my paperwork. The DA wanted to send me to prison for 25 years. The next day, I went back to court, and my paperwork was wrong. And my lawyer tried to convince me, just stay in jail for a couple of months. Why would you want to go to this program that's 12 months when you could just stay in jail for 2 and then get out? But something inside of me knew that I had to go to the program. So I went to court for the third time, and the DA had changed, and his brother had gone through Teen Challenge, and the bailiff's cousin had gone through Teen Challenge. So out of 20 people sitting in a jury box that day, I was the only one sentenced to leave, and I was sentenced to Teen Challenge. The judge looked me in the face and said, "I better not see you again." And I said, "No, sir, you won't." I stepped foot onto the Teen Challenge property, and my life has never been the same. I never craved another drug. I didn't crave cigarettes anymore. I didn't crave alcohol. 3 days after being in the program, I gave my heart to the Lord. After graduating the program, I met my husband, and we worked on staff together for Teen Challenge.
Our heart is to see God move in people's lives like He moved in our lives. And we are humbled and privileged and just honored that God would take 2 former criminals and drug addicts and transform our lives. It's not our stories as much as it is the love of Jesus Christ and the reality of who He is and how He saved us and kept His promise that He would never leave us or forsake us.